Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Yulia Ivanuk, and I'm the coordinator of the Center for Ukrainian Canadian Studies at the University of Manitoba. I'd like to start by acknowledging that the University of Manitoba campuses are located on the original lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dana peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that are made on these territories, we acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. It is a pleasure for me to welcome you to the CUC's lecture series. Today we will be discussing a very timely and yet difficult topic, gender and violence in Ukraine, changing how we bear witness to war. It is my great honor to welcome our speaker for today, Dr. Orysia Kulick, who many of you already know. Dr. Kulick is an assistant professor in the departments of political studies and German and Slavic studies at the University of Manitoba. Orysia's research and teaching interests include comparative politics, Soviet and post-Soviet Ukraine, modern European history, regionalism, empire, women and war, human rights, rebellion and revolution, science, technology, and World War II. Orysia, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Yulia. Just checking to see if you can hear me. Yes. I wanted to take this opportunity to thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak to our larger Canadian Ukrainian academic community. I think the events you hold are very interesting and have a broader reach. So I appreciate that opportunity. And because of the nature of the paper and the topic, I wanted to begin with something that I came across just a few days ago. It was written by, the reflections written by a Kyiv-based artist, filmmaker, and intellectual named Asya Bazdyryeva. And she wrote recently about a process that I think most of us can relate to in some way, about notes, emails, conversations, and even some relationships that are left unfinished or unpublished. They remain in a state of suspension because of the war. Bazdyryeva describes this state as post-traumatic silence, referring to the work of filmmaker Njoki Ngumi, who says silences are intensified by a power asymmetry wherein the individual has to prove their points while also being in a state of mourning. Not only does the grief itself have to be seen and judged to be worthy and sufficient, so does the text itself and the argument being put forward. This is the difficult position that scholars of Ukraine and Ukrainianists find themselves in this moment. And these asymmetries have a way of surfacing in the academy and in academic publishing as well. They have the effect of shutting down entire conversations. There are some very intrepid Ukrainianists who continue to press forward to make sure that Ukrainian voices are not drowned out by those pushing themselves asymmetrically into a void created by the withdrawal of Ukraine's specialists to safer ground, where they do not have to put their grief on display and go through the process of proving their points to their more detached colleagues who continuously shift the gaze and the conversation elsewhere. This piece, for me, was my way forward through this asymmetry. Though Bazdyryeva wrote these words just a few days ago, it really resonated with me as I reflected on the process of writing this paper. And this is my way of doing my part to make sure that some Ukrainian voices are not drowned out. And I'd like to thank James Krapfel and the Canadian Slavonic Papers, which commissioned a forum on Russia's invasion of Ukraine, to which I think 6 or 7 other scholars that work and focus on Ukraine all contributed to. He gave us full freedom to choose whatever topic we wish to write on, and he was an excellent and empathetic editor. So I'm grateful to him for creating this space in which a piece like this could be published. The piece itself is bears the title of this talk, Gender and Violence in Ukraine, Changing How We Bear Witness to War. The argument in the paper itself is longer and denser than we have time for today. Some of you may have read the paper in advance. And if there are aspects that you want to talk about that I don't get to, we can do that in the Q&A. But I did want to point out, for the academics in the room, there is a question of genre here. It's not reportage, nor is it journalism, nor is it dry and distant academic writing. This is something else. And we produced these pieces in a very, very compressed amount of time, I think about 4 months from when the piece was commissioned to when it went to publication. So bear that in mind as we sort of move through the arguments. I wanted to highlight a few ideas and issues that I raise in the paper, and as a means of explaining why I think centering gender and gender-based violence shows us things we might not otherwise see in this war in Ukraine. It brings into focus elements that are not always visible from other vantage points, other more distant, analytically dispassionate vantage points. It's an argument that suggests that we learn and gain a lot by flipping the script in this really important way. And my starting point was basically what I saw as a disconnect between what we were being told about Russia's war in Ukraine and why it invaded Ukraine in such a massive way on February 24th, and what we were seeing unfold on the ground in the early days of February and March. We were told this was a swift tactical war aimed at regime change in government in Kyiv, aimed at demanding forcefully Ukraine's geopolitical neutrality. The Finlandization of Ukraine is sometimes what it's referred to. We also heard something about denazification, which at the time was being interpreted in a variety of ways, also related to regime change. And that's the story we were told. The Russians expected Ukraine to fall in 3 days, that they would come in, install a new government, have a parade, a military parade in the streets of Kyiv, and go home. That is quite evidently not how things went. Then, once that sort of failed, we heard another narrative that, well, the Russians are simply not as good at this form of regime change as other world powers. And when their plan A failed, they resorted to what they know best. Scorched earth tactics that we've seen in Grozny and Aleppo and other locations like that. And I found that even as these explanations were being given, reports from the ground, from social media, from Ukrainian friends, families, colleagues, from Ukrainian publications, we could see that the tactics used almost immediately and their swift implementation pointed to a different explanation for this war, another set of motivations for Russia's invasion. And I went back to look at, Yulia and I were on a panel at the beginning of March where we shared some reactions to the war 8 days in. And I went back to look at that to see exactly how much had happened in those 8 days. And I reviewed my remarks, and we already saw from this firsthand testimony endless videos of densely populated cities being bombed by heavy artillery, fire, and rockets. Civilians, women, children, and the elderly being targeted, driven underground into bunkers where they waited out relentless assaults on densely populated civilian areas. We saw churches from the 17th century blown up. Other architectural wonders destroyed. We saw hospitals, schools, kindergartens hit with artillery and rocket fire. We saw malls and city centers hit with the same weaponry, where citizens at that point were going to find rapidly dwindling supplies of food and medicine and water. We saw museums holding precious artworks set ablaze, like those holding the artworks of Maria Primachenko, who commanded the admiration of none other than Pablo Picasso, I might add. We saw government buildings and universities targeted. We saw university professors, deeply compassionate and gentle bankers with whom I worked when I lived in Kyiv. They took up arms in self-defense. All of this had happened by March 4th. We saw Babi Yar desecrated by artillery fire. We saw then the refusal to create humanitarian corridors and instead incite a humanitarian catastrophe by preventing people from leaving and targeting people who were trying to leave. This points to stunning and stunningly grotesque motivations that were very clear almost from the very outset of this war. So that was the sort of setting when I agreed to write this paper for the Canadian Slavonic Papers. Within a matter of weeks, we then saw reports surfacing from the areas in and around Kyiv about Kadyrovtsi being spotted in the affluent suburbs to the north. These are names that are now well known to anybody following this war. Bucha, Hostomel, and other locations. Irpin, among others. And I mentioned in the article that this for me was a turning point in my conceptualization of this war, how I understood what was going on. And why would this be? I'm a scholar of Eastern Europe, Russia, the Soviet Union. I've read a lot about war, and I've taken classes about the experiences of East European women in times of war. I took that course with Catherine Jollick at Stanford University. It changed my view on the region itself, irrespective of whether or not we're discussing war, the experiences of women. And I wrote for that class a paper on women's experiences during the Chechen Wars. And I read testimony of women who had lived through the first and second Chechen Wars. And I knew what kinds of I knew what they had experienced, and I was now focused on what might happen to Ukrainian women with the presence of these particular forces. Kadyrovtsi are soldiers loyal to the Chechen warlord Ramzan Kadyrov. I read these testimonies in 2011, 2012, somewhere around there, and they have stuck with me ever since. So, and I think based on what we've been seeing in Ukraine, you might have an idea of why that is. So I found myself, trying to come up with a paper topic. I should be writing about oligarchs or something to do with the economy, because that's what my research focuses on. But my attention kept getting pulled to what might be going on in the suburbs north of Kyiv. I even asked my research assistant to start investigating this, collecting stories in the press, reports that might be coming up. I had to apologize to her when we finally met and say, I'm sorry, I did not actually realize how bad this was going to get. But I thought it was important to keep a record and to bear witness, because women's stories are always, almost always, buried under geopolitics and highly ideologized interpretations of world events. It always happens, and I wanted to make sure that it didn't happen this time. It was also doubly excruciating to think about this, because one of my closest friends in Ukraine had actually moved from Kyiv to Bucha some years ago. I knew she lived near the airport. She talked to me about constant heavy fighting from the very first days of the war. I saw or interpreted the terror from what was said and not said in our very brief exchanges to one another. They took the form of telegrams. Are you fine? Heart emoji. And that's all anybody had time for in those days. Her last message to me was on March 5th. My last message to her was on not last. She did make it out of Bucha, but there was a period in which I was not sure of her whereabouts. She wrote me on March 5th. I wrote back on March 10th, and then weeks went by, and I wasn't sure what was going on. And then came the withdrawal of Russian troops from the areas north of Kyiv and the horrifying scene that they left behind. And the only reason that I knew that they had made it out is because I saw a post on social media that indicated that they were somewhere safe with internet. Gender-based violence figured prominently in what we discovered in Bucha. We learned about rape, gang rapes, groups of women being held in basements and repeatedly assaulted. We saw evidence of torture of men and boys of fighting age. I remember also seeing a photo before they started getting pulled down off Twitter of a man lying face down with his pants pulled down to his knees. The comments didn't mention anything about rape or sexual torture, but when I saw that photograph, I couldn't imagine that anything else had happened. We saw evidence of fleeing civilians shot on sight. We saw evidence of hunting parties where soldiers are shooting civilians for sport. We saw charred bodies left at the side of the road. And all of this is being processed in real time for this article and by all of us who are following this war. And I had agreed to submit this piece by May 15th. The task then became, how do you interpret this information in a way that is useful in an academic setting? How do we make sense of extreme cruelty, given what we thought we knew about the reasons for this war? The how was calling seriously into question the why. In other words, evidence from the ground was not aligning with the reasons given for Russia's invasion. I remind, it's a proxy war. It's yet another proxy war between the United States and Russia. This is a war over resources. This is part of the new great game. This is all very rational and strategic. I didn't see that narrative holding together the more we looked at what was going on. And the timing of this onset of cruelty, which we see from the very, very beginning, also calls into question this shift in tactics explanation we were also subjected to for many weeks and months. The argument being, well, Plan A failed, and this is simply how Russians and Soviets wage war. What else would you expect? I didn't buy that argument either. It is not sufficient, in my view, as an explanation. I think it doesn't help matters that we, as scholars of Russia, of Eastern Europe, as a collective, avoid discussion of gender-based violence in general. It should, given the history of this continent, this region, actually figure rather prominently in our conversations, but it doesn't. We also don't talk much about, and I mentioned this in the article, violence in various institutions, the military, orphanages, schools, etc., that is sort of fueling this from within. I also teach the politics of memory, and we keep talking week after week, this term about how silences in our personal lives are actually reflected and reproduced as silences in the academy. We see this time and again, topics we don't want to talk about at home. We also don't want to talk about at work. And that's why pieces such as these are so difficult to write. I wanted to pause. I wanted to also reinforce another aspect of this piece, which examined the purpose of sexual violence and torture in contexts like these. It's important not just to note that these kinds of assaults are happening, but to also think about how and why these acts are committed. What is said and communicated by the perpetrators while they are committing these crimes. All these discrete pieces of data are coming together to paint a picture that is much more complex and gruesome than the one that was given to us at the outset. This is a war of a different kind that is motivated centrally by a different purpose. And we can think about that while also acknowledging global structures and larger social forces at play. Those two things do not have to be in opposition to one another. We can actually hold those things in conversation together. As this paper was going to print, it was in the final stages of editing. There was an article by Joshua Yaffa that came out in the New Yorker. I don't know if you read it. Came out in July. It's titled "The Psychologists Treating Rape Victims in Ukraine," a grassroots effort to offer mental health care to Ukrainians who have faced sexual violence at the hands of the Russian invasion force. So he interviewed a number of psychologists to get a sense of the kinds of things that they were dealing with and what we can learn from their insights. And his piece affirmed the argument that came together in the paper and also deepened its implications. I didn't have time to really incorporate what he said, but I want to share that with you here today. Some of it came across in the section that discusses Marta Havryshko and her work on gender-based violence across various wars in this period. So it's confirmed that these rapes are taking place not in private, but publicly. They're taking place in front of others. They're committed in groups of masked, anonymous soldiers. You know, what we permit ourselves to do behind the veil of anonymity, it has the effect of ramping up the brutality to maximum levels. Yaffa wrote that, quote, "The effect of the crowd, plus the fact that many attackers had their faces covered, created an aura of anonymity, removing any sense of fear or norms and pushing each person towards maximum barbarity," end quote. And this is from the mouth of one of the therapists. That same therapist said that the aim appeared to be to inflict enough psychological and physical damage to make sure that the victims no longer wished to procreate. And that it was clear from what was communicated between soldiers and victims that they would say things like, "You should know that the Russian army is strong so that you fear us, remember us and fear us." He went on to say they didn't mean you as an individual, as in you, Tanya, or you, Oля, so to speak, but as a people, as a whole nation. And this has implications. This has very serious implications for this war, what we are called to do in response. And I'm going to return to that in a moment. I wanted to make one final point that Marta Havryshko and other scholars who have been following this have made. When you situate sexual torture and violence within the larger context of what is going on in Ukraine, it really brings into sharp focus what is going on. We've mentioned the indiscriminate violence against civilians. The city of Kharkiv, for instance, has been bombed every single day since February 24th. We have seen book burning. We have seen incendiary genocidal rhetoric from the Kremlin. We have evidence that the Russians have used flechettes, tiny arrows that are designed to maximally injure individuals. Using those in densely populated urban areas is a way to maximize injury and casualties. We've seen children being taken from Ukraine into the interior of Russia to be assimilated and re-educated. We have seen changes to the educational curriculum, and the list goes on. We have terminology for what we're seeing. Some are more comfortable using it than others, but we are talking about, crimes against peace. We are talking about a war of aggression, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the fourth is the one that's currently under discussion, and that is the crime of genocide. I think, withdrawing from this conversation because it makes us uncomfortable is not going to help us move forward. And there was a resonance with Bosnian women who in the very, very beginning and early stages of this war evaluated what they were seeing come through the news, and they swiftly made the connections to their own experiences during the Bosnian wars of the 1990s, and they called for Ukrainian women and the authorities to document as extensively as possible evidence of sexual torture and violence, because it will at some point be part of evidence that may or may not, that could be used at a war crimes tribunal if it should happen. It happened in Bosnia, and those resonances are something we also need to think about. The paper, I don't know, I have just one more thing to say, and the paper ends with kind of a reflection on where this leaves us as scholars of this region. I'm not sure what we call ourselves anymore, but for a long time, we referred to ourselves as Russianists. Some of us refer to ourselves as Slavicists. There are East Europeanists, but I think this war has thrown all of that into confusion, because whether Russian studies or Slavic studies, these are studies that revolve around the Russian Federation throughout time. And what do we do as a field when the country around which our academic life and teaching revolves has launched a war of this kind on the second largest Soviet republic, one of the largest countries in Europe? How do we process that for ourselves? How do we understand that? And what do we do about it going forward? So I think that's it for me. Yulia indicated about half an hour would be sufficient, and then we can open it up for questions. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much for this detailed presentation. Also, thank you for generously sharing a copy of the article with us, which you can find in the chat box if any of you are interested. Now I'd like to open the floor for discussion, so feel free to submit your questions into the Q&A chat box, or you can also raise your hand, and I will happily call on you to ask a question if you would like. Yes, while everyone is getting their thoughts together, I could start with a question that I was thinking about. So, Orysia, you pointed out in your articles that you found it striking how, as we are witnessing Vladimir Putin talking about a neighboring country as an abusive partner might talk to an ex, while most of the analysts tended to focus on the more quote-unquote rational causes of the geopolitical conflict. Could you please expand on this point, and perhaps you could also elaborate as to why is it that the geopolitical or strictly realpolitik lenses are not sufficient to understand the Russia-Ukraine relations?
Right. Well, there's a famous exchange between Russian President, I mean, not a direct exchange, but an exchange between Russian President Vladimir Putin and Ukrainian President Zelensky, in which he said, "Нравится, не нравится, терпи, моя красавица," which is, you may like it, you may not, but you'll have to put up with it. And this was interpreted by quite a number of Russian speakers as the threat of rape, that you may like it, you may not, but this is going to happen against your will. And he was talking about implementing the Minsk Accords, the fact that Ukraine had failed in its obligations, and that was one of the reasons that the war in the Donbass has been dragging on for so long, and one of the reasons why the situation had escalated, the resolution of the status of the DNR and the LNR. But this kind of abusive rhetoric was very reminiscent of, as I said, the ways in which abusive exes might talk to partners who are trying to leave. And that this casts the relationship of Ukraine and Russia into a different light. It highlights this sort of older colonial dynamics between them. It highlights the difference in status. It also highlights the possessiveness of the Russian leadership of this particular country, land, peoples. They think it's theirs. I think thinking about the dynamic in that way helps us see that a bit more, the sort of colonial war of conquest dimension of it that might not come across as clearly if you're just looking at this sort of realpolitik situation. We have some comments in the chat. Finessing my loose translation of the phrase. In that phrase, there's not only you have to take it, but also something like my darling at the end, my beautiful girl, if I'll try to translate it detail. Thank you very much, Aima. Rose says, considering that most acts of sexual violence go unreported, especially among male victims, where it's more often reported as torture, how do you document and verify the extent of gender-related violence during the war? That is a great question. They have a number of mechanisms in Ukraine for keeping track of this, but they all say that rape is underreported, that for every case that comes through in the hotlines or is reported to the authorities, there are 20 more that we will never learn about, that we'll never hear about because of either an unwillingness to report or the shame and fear that's associated with sexual assault. And especially in the case of men, where it's reported as torture, I think there's a lot that we're not going to know about or learn about, but there are people on the ground doing their best to make sure that that we have documentation.
To follow up on the previous point, Orysia, could perhaps you have some ideas or thoughts that you could share about how this stigma can be broken, and how do we make sure that gender conversations are inclusive of all the affected groups?
I think that the stigma surrounding this crime is so heavy, and that's one of the reasons I think it's being used quite openly as a weapon of war, because it's extremely effective in, I refer to it as planting ticking time bombs within families, the community, the nation, as a means of sort of ripping it apart from within. I think we're a long way from destigmatizing, and I'm not sure. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not sure of the path forward, but bringing this out into the light is my way of doing that as a scholar, is to talk about it more openly as part of our conversation about this war.
We have another great question from Olga. She's wondering about the ethics of portraying information about gender-based violence, and how should media talk about the facts of sexual violence in order to attract public attention and do it in a conscientious way towards those who might be viewing it.
Well, that's a great question, because it was actually a fairly significant problem in the early stages, and it's actually still happening on Twitter, where you have, and I'm not on other forms of social media, so I don't know what happens on Facebook and other places like that, but there is a widespread sharing of images of POWs, for instance, which should not be circulating anywhere. That violates the Geneva Conventions. And in the aftermath of Bucha, there was a lot of imagery that was circulating that also, I think, may not have been ethically done so. I mean, there were photographs that I saw of women's bodies charred and mutilated on the side of the road. There was a photograph that I saw of a family with a child who looked about 3, stripped naked. So there were questions about what was going on with that. They're shocking, but within Ukraine, this generated a conversation about how we should go about this, and that the efforts to make sure that these are prosecuted properly, that they're investigated, that they're verified, was being undermined by this excessive sharing of photographs and other information that was in one interpreted as being deliberately incendiary. The ombudswoman for Ukraine was asked to leave her post for posting information that had not been verified or triangulated by the authorities, putting both the victims at risk and also the legal process needed to prosecute those crimes. We should be talking about sexual violence in a much more careful way rather than a sensationalizing way, and definitely thinking twice about what we post and repost on social media.
Thank you for reflecting so thoughtfully on this one. And we have another question from the audience. Ashley has a question related to the parallel that you have identified between the war in Bosnia and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Women survivors of wartime sexual violence faced horrific stigma after their victimization in Bosnia, and did you find any indication of similar cases and similar perceptions in Ukraine?
I'm not sure. I think it may be. I've been observing this all from a bit of a distance. I don't know. I don't have enough firsthand accounts of what is happening on the ground in Ukraine, and also in Poland and other locations where women who have experienced this have fled. Does anyone else in the room have any indication of whether or not this is happening in Ukraine as well? Anybody who's
If anyone has a comment, feel free to raise your hand and we will unmute you.
I mean, my sense is that it's still too soon to know, but I think you're pointing to something that is likely going to surface as a problem in this context as well. It seems to be one of the underlying reasons for using this as a weapon of war.
Orysia, you have provided examples of Russian women legitimizing their partner's rape of Ukrainians. How would you conceptualize the support that the Russian public, including women, have been expressing towards the use of sexual violence against the Ukrainian population?
Well, yeah, there was a few intercepted phone calls between a husband and wife where they were discussing openly the rape of Ukrainian women. There was a conversation that involved, they were talking about it. There was intermittent chuckling. He kind of asked, well, is it okay if I do it? In a sort of exploratory way. She chuckled and answered, well, if you use condoms and don't tell me about it afterwards. So there's an awareness that this is happening. I think there's an awareness that it's happening in part to humiliate Ukrainian women, to demonstrate, as I said, how despised and unimportant they are in this case. And I think given the sort of larger alarming discursive sphere that we see developing in Russia, where there's a lot of denigrating, dehumanizing language being used in reference to Ukraine and Ukrainian women. There is commentary about them being prostitutes or floor moppers, so there's issue of status there. We've seen this kind of language at both inside Russia, on social media, as if they're in some way deserving of this treatment, and that it's part of, and that it's fine as long as it's happening over there, beyond the pale, beyond the stakes, where the cruelty of the civilized is permitted. You know, as long as it's happening over there with those inferior individuals who have been led astray from the great Russian flock, then it doesn't seem to bother them, which is really actually quite disconcerting, because we've seen these patterns before in history.
Indeed, it has been really disturbing to see sexual violence accompanied by the genocidal rhetoric being used strategically, I would say, against the Ukrainian civilians and also the POWs. And it is not simply a consequence of warfare, as we can tell. Why is it that gender-based violence is such a notoriously stigmatized, underestimated, and underreported theme, both in media and in academia? I'd be really curious to hear your thoughts on this one.
Well, I mean, I think it forces us to examine, as I said, examine things that we prefer not to discuss in our private lives. It points to these really core. It requires of us a shift in modalities and a shift in understanding of what exactly it is that we're observing and talking about. It's much easier to float above in the comfortable, analytically distant realm of geopolitics and just point fingers and say, well, these mistakes that have come around, that have happened since the 1990s when the Americans made and broke promises to Gorbachev and the Soviets, and we can draw a direct line from that point to this point, and it's very easy for us to sort of make sense of it, put it into frames that already exist and don't require us to rethink fundamentally, not just what's going on there, but the human experience. I mean, we are seeing a very illiberal turn worldwide. We are seeing a sort of well, I'll just say it because I can't think of anything else. I can't think of a substitute. We're seeing a war on women worldwide, and that, if we actually fully embrace the implications of that and gender-based violence, then then we have to prepare ourselves for a total moral reset. And I think that's why it's much easier to shift the conversation elsewhere.
Thank you, Orysia. And I can see that Pani Olena Hordienko has raised her hand. So if you could please go ahead with your question.
Good afternoon, everyone. It was a great pleasure to be invited to such an interesting webinar. I don't have a question. I just want to express my feedback to this urgent and very up-to-date problem to us, as just we are real witnesses of all these events in Ukraine. And as I, with my daughter and some of my colleagues who are also here in Canada, we had no choice. We had just to take our children and to run away from Ukraine. Because first we thought that maybe we would have such possibility, something like green corridors, to escape, to go away. But then, after some events in Ukraine, we understood that there would be no such possibilities, and that's all. So we are here just to survive. And as for the problem of gender-based violence, of course, we should all try to solve this issue step by step in complex, not only journalists, not only sociolinguists, but altogether. I think we should try to develop some complex maybe approach, and to encourage sociolinguists, psychologists, politicians, journalists, maybe interpreters, maybe I don't know, different specialists and try not to keep silence because we should encourage all communities, not only Ukrainian communities. And of course, we should give such an opportunity for those people who were under violence to know that they will be given this help. They will be able to express, to share all these things, because, for example, some weeks ago, I have my nephew, and he was present in Yelenovka. It is in Donetsk region, and I know that I have all the time. I'm very close with him, and these days I asked him all the time that, of course, I know that he's not going to talk to me, but I connected with psychologists, with psychiatrists from the university I worked, because I'm a lecturer at Medical University of Zaporizhia at the Department of Foreign Languages, and I know these colleagues, and also now they help him, and I think that step by step everyone should help, and we should we mustn't keep silence. We should share this information in our families, among our communities, and thank you for you dealing with this problem and taking care of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much for these important remarks, and I can see that Dr. Yeager has a question as well.
Yeah, thank you, Yulia. Yeah, thank you, Orysia, for this very thought-inspiring talk. I'm getting back, I think, from the practical and so important real side, which Olena just kind of talked about, to the more scholarly side in a way, what we can learn through possibly existing scholarship or what has to happen on the side of scholarships to deal with these kind of silences. So I'm really wondering about the comparative side here in a way. Of course, it came already up in the discussion about how it relates to women in Bosnia. But I'm thinking, is there, from what you know, any research on other conflicts? Obviously, you could think about rape against women that obviously was silenced, and how does that compare to what we experience now? So in a way, is that something where the differences come out? So for example, if you take the Soviet army and the kind of and German women at the end of the Second World War, obviously you have a totally different situation about silences, because you have kind of enemies going against each other. If you take the less but still existing rape of Allied armies, similar thing. You have a different situation in a way why it was silent, although it was silent in all cases, obviously, at least from the one side. And then the same thing if we go into Afghanistan, Rwanda, and other kind of conflicts where rapes were obviously quite prevalent. So is there anything we can learn comparatively? Are we at a totally different situation media-wise in 2022 that makes it different than it, let's say, at the end of the Second World War or even in the 1990s? So anything we can learn from other gender and war scholars there?
No, absolutely. I absolutely agree. I think there's a lot to learn through comparison. I do teach comparative politics, so I'm very much in support of that. But as with any kind of discussion of war and mass violence, I'm as a historian, I think that through the art of comparison, we also learn about what makes each and every one of these occurrences unique on its own terms. We see patterns, we see larger patterns. You pointed to the Soviet march on Berlin. And in my research for this paper, I found really sort of alarming stickers and messaging during the annual commemorations of the Soviet victory over Nazi Germany. This language, хотите, можем повторить, and with stickers with accompanying visuals of rape. And it is well known in the scholarship that the Soviet army engaged in mass rapes throughout the territories on its march to Berlin. And That's something that is avoided, I think, openly in Russia. It's taboo to discuss it as part of its sort of image management. Yet at the same time, every year on Victory Day, you have cars that emerge with this kind of messaging. So I think there's things to learn from our own context through time. And I also think, revisiting what exactly happened in Bosnia, Rwanda, other locations is also important. I do think that you point out something important, and it's come up in the Q&A about the ethics of what we report, how quickly we're being confronted with this information. And I do think that makes what we're seeing in 2022 different. And we've also seen, and I do my best to avoid, coming across these things, but we've seen castrations of soldiers, Ukrainian POWs who are captured by Russian forces and castrated in the field. And that makes its way on social media, and you have to try really hard not to see those things. And I think that is having a direct impact on how this war is being conducted and how it's being processed. So yes to comparison, yes to also understanding each war on its own terms.
Thanks.
Thank you, Orysia. And we have another question in the Q&A from Olha. Is Russia's war against Ukraine, including the gender-based violence, being covered sufficiently by media, or is this topic losing saliency?
I think it's losing ground because it's in the coverage in the press. You could see it sort of fading from the front pages unless something big happens, like over the weekend when almost all city centers in non-Russian occupied Ukraine were hit. Civilian infrastructure, water, electricity, heat, everything knocked out all over the country. That pushes the Ukraine story back to the surface. When there's nuclear saber rattling from the Kremlin, we kind of cycle back to, is this the beginning of World War III and a nuclear apocalypse? So this are sort of more sensational elements of this war. The sort of day-to-day agony and that is experienced throughout the country, that has faded, I think partly due to fatigue, informational fatigue, and partly I think it's tied to how the news cycle works, and partly I think it's because we're not sure how it will end and how long this will go. So I think that all those three things work together, and we also have very short attention spans as people in this 24-hour news cycle. So unfortunately, I think the Ukraine story is largely sort of fading into the background a bit as one of these very long wars, much like we saw in Afghanistan or Syria.
Thank you. And there's another question from the audience related to whether there are any therapies or programs already in place for those who have experienced sexual gender-based violence in this war. And these could be an opportunity for the victim survivors to bear witness to their own trauma. Also, what might these be or could be from a culturally sensitive point of view? If you could comment on this one as well, that would be.
I mean, there are programs in place, but as this article by Joshua Yaffa that I mentioned earlier, when did it come out? In July, mid-July. It indicates that local psychologists on the ground are having trouble professionally processing what they're listening to, thinking up of approaches that are not going to do additional harm. they are confronting a phenomenon that they are having challenges treating, and they're having to consult with one another. They're keeping sessions shorter so as not to make things worse for the patients that they're treating. So I think it poses a challenge. It poses a serious challenge in that way. I don't know if solutions have been found, but I know that they are actively working on how to best handle the situation and to best treat the patients that are coming in, and to do so in a way that heals rather than inflicts additional trauma.
And there's a comment also in the Q&A from Irina Konstantiuk related to the human rights activists in Russia that report rapes in Russian jails. So it's a way of humiliation used in Russia in relation to their own people. We know that the Russian society never self-reflected on the mistakes of the past, never ceased to think as an empire, and therefore the culture of violence and humiliation persisted. And some would even argue that Russia is an empire that colonized itself. So is there a way, or is there any hope that the Russian society will change, or will get this opportunity for self-reflection in the future?
Well, yes, I have heard about these instances of activists being arrested and then raped or tortured in prison. The same happened in Belarus a few years ago as a consequence of election-related protests, and you have this, scene unfolding in the prison. You can hear screams from the outside. That is a way. These mechanisms are designed to sow terror and to, atomize society and to pull people apart from one another. And it can be used in domestic. It is being used in domestic contexts as well. The Russian leadership, I think, has been preparing for this war for a very long time, and has sort of taken steps to make sure that this sort of organic opposition isn't really on solid footing anymore. I mean, both by designating organizations as foreign agents, using these kinds of methods in prison to discourage activism, to discourage people from speaking out. I also think that Russians have enough information coming in to interpret what's going on. I think at a certain level, this idea of Russia hermetically sealed off from information, except that which is found on state-controlled TV, is a fiction. I mean, beyond a certain generation, okay, if you're just watching TV and that's all the information you get, maybe an argument can be made. But I think Russians know what's going on, and have a lot of work ahead of them.
Thank you so much for this important comment. And we have one last question or comment from the audience. So, Olha, please go ahead.
Hello to everyone. Laura asked about the psychological program, and I know that the Kyiv State administration has own program of psychological help for victims of sexual violence. I know about it, and it works very well now. But I know only about Kyiv. And I want to say to Pani Orysia, for a researcher, especially a woman, this is a very difficult topic, and this is clear for me. And I researched criminal chronicles in Ukrainian newspapers of the 1920s, 1930s. They were the first announcements of sexual violence against women, and it was difficult for me to get them to investigate this about victims of sexual violence. But I'm sure this should be highlighted in the scientific discourse, not only in media discourse. And I'm grateful to you for this work, for this paper, and for this way of your scientific research. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for the comment, and thank you, Orysia, so much for your analysis of this important topic and for answering all of our questions today. And also thank you to all of you for joining us here today for this webinar, and please stay tuned for further events in the future.